Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate this afternoon in response to the Prime Minister's statement. I think it's a good step for this House to be following. But I think the next step is for such statements in future to be made direct to the Parliament and not to an interested audience of notables and worthies outside of the Parliament in advance of this important occasion. Mr Speaker, from the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 through to the most recent American intervention in Iraq, the history of Western intervention in the Middle East has not always led to peaceable outcomes. We've certainly seen more confusion, more upheaval and more bitterness created by some of those interventions over the years. And that is why I think the government has taken a prudent course in ruling out any form of military involvement by New Zealand in the campaign against ISIS. I think that that is not just a recognition of our particular strength or lack thereof, but it's also correct in terms of the course of history. And I must say in passing that the sending of military advisers to Iraq is, in my view, at the outer limit of acceptability. But the issue really now comes down to a humanitarian one. No one, anywhere, can tolerate the barbarity, the brutality, the exhibitionism and the crudity of the ISIS terrorists. What we've seen in the media, in social media, is unacceptable by any norm. But, Mr Speaker, we need to be very careful that we do not transfer our abhorrence of this behaviour into a lack of understanding, preparedness to even consider the political views that lie behind that most brutal expression. And that is why it is appropriate for countries like New Zealand to work through humanitarian assistance to the affected parties and to do, as the Prime Minister's speech earlier today made reference to, assist with the construction of sound institutions of state and forms of governance to promote democratic ideals, to promote the sorts of values that we might regard as important in a free society, rather than a brutal suppression of those ideas because we abhor the methods that the proponents use. Just as we might later today celebrate, although some of us might commiserate with the demise of Guy Fawkes 500 years ago because of the methods that he used, the same risk we cannot get into with regard to our treatment of the ISIS terrorists. Mr Speaker, there are a number of measures contained in the Prime Minister's announcement that I want to comment on specifically. If I can put on my hat as the Minister of Internal Affairs for just a moment, I think that the changes proposed to the passports legislation are appropriate. The current legislation has been shown to have some deficiencies, particularly in terms of the duration of a suspension, but also the definition used, which at the moment is specific to the interests of New Zealand. The question that then arises as to how those interests might be interpreted. Are they New Zealand's domestic interests or wider interests, or a combination of both? So I think that the changes proposed in that respect are positive, and there are safeguards contained within those proposals that means that we will not get a ridiculous or rampant use of those provisions. Mr Speaker, I think the same can be said for the changes regarding surveillance by the SIS, although I have some misgivings about aspects of that, but broadly speaking, they line up with the provisions that the police already have. They will be subject to a warrant, and that warrant, under the legislation changes last year, is much more accountable publicly than was the case previously. In an ideal world, these changes would have awaited the outcome of the review of the SIS and the GCSB due to occur after the 30th of June next year. But I accept that that may not be a practical step, even though it might be a preferable one. And I think that the idea of therefore having some sunset clauses about those particular provisions is a good one. But I echo a comment that was made by an earlier speaker. I want to ensure that the sunset is exercised not at the last minute, but as soon as the changes that arise from the review next year are put in place. And Mr Speaker, I must say that I do have some concerns about the additional funding being advanced to the SAS, the $7 million. I think that that's a matter that requires more scrutiny in terms of the direction of that expenditure, the purposes to which it's being put. And I'm sure that that's something that the Intelligence and Security Committee will turn its mind to in due course. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, there was a comment in the Prime Minister's statement regarding greater international intelligence cooperation. Mr. Speaker, I have some very real misgivings about that because I have lingering concerns about the capacity of our GCSB to contribute effectively to that process. And it seems to me that what we are reliant on in a lot of cases is external intelligence coming in to New Zealand to assist us in the decisions that we might make. And in that context, I therefore worry about what we might be doing in terms of greater cooperation. And I would hate to think that we are in a position where the particular circumstances that we are concerned about properly with regard to the rise of ISIS are being used as a cover or an excuse for a more broadening extension of intelligence powers and practices than might otherwise be the case. I've not heard that suggested, and I hope it is not in fact the reality. Mr. Speaker, I think for many people, what we've seen in recent weeks has really jolted their attention in terms of the march of international terrorism, and it's given us a new sense of how small and vulnerable our world is. The romantic notions that perhaps our grandparents might have told us about the troops that marched off to be part of the International Battalion during the Spanish Civil War and the fight against Franco and fascism do not apply today. Communication is more instant. Communication is more sinister. Planning is more devious. It's not some romantic march for freedom as those fighters in the International Battalion might have been on in the 1930s. So it is appropriate for states to do things to protect themselves and their citizenry from the threat of such attacks. Now, the numbers for New Zealand may well be small, but those people have contacts. Those people are a relatively fluid group, and we know that they don't simply sit around and just talk to each other. They talk to a range of other people, and Mr. Speaker, I think that that is where we as citizens have a right to be both concerned and then assured that the appropriate steps are being taken to protect our safety as individuals and also our safety as a nation. We have seen examples in other countries of quite random, quite significant in the sense of particular attacks on individuals. It's not so much a case of the grand attack anymore, it seems to me, but a much more immediate, random attack which cuts at the very core of the confidence of a society. And be it plans for moves in Australia that have been thwarted, or be it the assassination of innocent citizens in Canada or in the United Kingdom, the risk is nonetheless the same. And so the issue for New Zealand is what can we do to protect our citizens in that respect. The safeguard that we have is that the measures that have been announced are, in my view, prudent, but that they will also be examined by a select committee before they are passed by this House. Mr. Speaker, I want to say this to the Prime Minister. I think it was a good step to make the statement in the way that he did this morning, and I think that if there are to be future iterations of this process, they should be made in the same way to this Parliament, where they can be debated and a consensus secured for the measures that we might be about to take. Because, Mr. Speaker, the best way of securing our freedom for the future is to ensure that we've all bought into the concept of what it is we're trying to secure right from the outset. A divided House or a divided country, frankly, in these sorts of situations, leaves us nowhere. So, Mr. Speaker, I think today is a useful start. There's a lot of ground yet to cover, and I look forward to further discussions and debate as the tides continue to flow.